That apartment of yours is pathetic, Margaret. Ashley said it so casually that for a moment I wondered if she even realized how quiet the room had become. The word hung in the air like a thin crack across glass. Pathetic. My son Daniel chuckled softly beside her, the kind of polite laugh people give when they don't want to disagree with their spouse. I kept my hands folded in my lap and looked down at the photograph Ashley had been holding. It was just a simple photo I had shown them a few minutes earlier, taken on my old phone. A small brick apartment, building on Maple Street. 2 stories. White trim around the windows. A narrow front porch with a wooden railing that my late husband Harold had once painted himself on a warm June afternoon nearly 30 years ago. To Ashley, it was nothing more than an old building in a quiet neighborhood. To me, it was something entirely different. But I didn't explain that. I simply nodded once and reached for my teacup. The tea had already gone cold, but I took a sip anyway.
I'm Margaret Collins.
I'm 69 years old, a widow for almost 4 years now, and I've learned that silence often says more than arguments ever could. Ashley leaned back in her chair with the confident ease of someone who has never had to fix a leaking pipe at midnight or stretch a grocery budget through the last week of the month. I mean, honestly, she continued with a small shrug, you should just sell it. Places like that barely make anything these days. Daniel nodded again, though he avoided looking directly at me. My son has always been a gentleman, but marriage has a way of shifting a person's center of gravity. I set the teacup down carefully on the table. The ceramic made a soft sound against the wood. No one spoke for a moment. Outside the dining room window, a light autumn wind moved through the maple tree in the front yard. Leaves scraped quietly across the glass like whispers. I thought about Harold then. About the long weekends we spent renovating that little apartment building after he bought it with money he had saved for years. He used to joke that it wasn't just an investment. It was our insurance policy for the future. Back then I didn't understand exactly what he meant. Now I do. Ashley pushed the photograph back across the table toward me, as if she were sliding away a restaurant menu she had no interest in. I'm just saying, she added lightly, no one wants to live in something that's small anymore. I folded the photograph and slipped it back into my purse. My movements were slow and careful, the way people move when they are trying not to reveal what they're thinking. The truth was, Ashley had never even stepped inside that apartment. She had never seen the hardwood floors Harold restored plank by plank, or the tall windows that catch the afternoon sun just right around 3 o'clock. She had never noticed the quiet little bakery across the street or the park 2 blocks down where children still ride bicycles in the evenings. But none of that mattered to her. To Ashley, value only existed when it looked impressive. I stood up from the table and smoothed the sleeves of my cardigan. Well, I said calmly, it's still standing. Daniel looked slightly uncomfortable, as if he expected me to defend myself or argue. But I didn't. Because arguing would have ruined the moment that was quietly waiting just around the corner of my life. And what Ashley didn't know, what neither of them knew, was that the tenant who had just moved into that pathetic apartment on Maple Street was scheduled to stop by the next morning. And he was bringing the first rent check with him. The next morning the sky over Maple Street was pale and quiet, the kind of soft gray morning that makes the whole neighborhood feel like it is waking up slowly. I arrived a little after 8 o'clock. The same way I had done many times over the years. The small parking lot beside the building was still empty except for one silver sedan that had appeared a few days earlier when the new tenant moved in. I unlocked the front door and stepped into the hallway. The scent of fresh coffee drifted faintly through the air vents, which made me smile without realizing it. Someone was clearly awake already. I walked slowly through the building the way I always did, checking small things most people never notice. The hallway light, the mailboxes, the little potted plant near the staircase that I watered every Sunday. Harold used to say, a building talks to you if you take the time to listen. Loose hinges, small creaks, a change in the smell of the air. After 30 years, I knew every sound this place could make. I climbed the stairs to the second floor and paused near apartment 2B. The door was slightly open, and I could hear someone moving around inside, the steady rhythm of a person getting ready for the day. A moment later the door opened wider and Ethan Brooks stepped into the hallway with a friendly nod when he saw me. He looked exactly the way I remembered from when we signed the lease 3 days earlier. Early 30s, tall, clean cut, wearing a light blue button-down shirt and dark slacks like someone who had an office waiting for him somewhere downtown. "Good morning, Mrs. Collins," he said with the polite tone that younger people rarely use anymore. I returned the greeting and asked how his first few days had been. Ethan smiled in that relaxed way people do when they have already decided they like a place. "Honestly," he said, "I did not expect it to feel this comfortable so quickly. The windows let in a lot of light in the afternoon, and the neighborhood is quieter than I thought it would be. That pleased me more than I let on." Many people underestimate quiet neighborhoods. They do not realize how valuable peace becomes as the years pass. Ethan reached into the leather briefcase he carried and pulled out a simple white envelope. "I believe this is for you," he said. "First month of rent." I took the envelope with both hands the same careful way Harold had always done when handling anything important. It was heavier than most rent envelopes I had received in the past, though I did not open it immediately. Instead, I thanked him and asked if everything inside the apartment was working properly. The heater, the faucets, the kitchen lights. Ethan nodded and assured me that everything worked perfectly. In fact, he said the place felt solid in a way most newer buildings did not. That word stayed with me for a moment. Solid. I wished Harold could have heard that. Ethan checked his watch and apologized that he needed to leave for work, but before heading toward the stairs, he paused and added something that caught my attention. "By the way," he said with a small smile, "I hope the amount is correct." I decided to round it up a little because I planned to stay here a long time. I watched him walk down the staircase, the quiet sound of his footsteps fading toward the front door. Only after the building returned to silence did I slowly open the envelope in my hands. I did not open the envelope right away. Instead, I walked slowly down the hallway and stepped into the small office at the back of the building, the same room Harold and I used for paperwork for nearly 3 decades. The room was simple. A wooden desk, a metal filing cabinet, a small window that faced the alley where the morning sunlight always slipped in around 9 o'clock. I sat down in Harold's old chair and placed the envelope carefully on the desk in front of me. For a moment, I just looked at it. The paper was thick and clean, the handwriting neat. Ethan Brooks had written my name in blue ink across the front. Mrs. Margaret Collins. It felt strangely formal, and I realized how rarely people wrote my name like that anymore. I reached for the letter opener that still sat in the top drawer of the desk. Harold had bought it from a hardware store years ago. Nothing fancy. Just a simple steel blade with a wooden handle worn smooth from use. I slid the opener along the edge of the envelope and lifted the flap. Inside was a check and a folded note. I unfolded the note first. The message was short and written in the same careful handwriting. "Thank you for trusting me with the apartment. It already feels like home. I hope the amount is acceptable." I smiled slightly at that. Acceptable. That word sounded almost shy. I set the note aside and lifted the check from the envelope. For a second, I thought I had read the number wrong. I blinked once and looked again. The amount written across the center of the check was $2,500. I leaned back in the chair slowly, letting the quiet of the room settle around me. The agreed rent had been $900 a month. That was the amount we had both signed on the lease just 3 days earlier. I looked again at the number. $2,500. I checked the signature. Ethan Brooks. The date was correct. Everything about the check looked completely normal except for the amount. I stood up and walked to the window, holding the check lightly between my fingers. Outside, the alley was still quiet, the silver sedan already gone now that Ethan had left for work. I thought about the conversation we had just had in the hallway. His calm voice. The way he said he hoped the amount was correct. Slowly, the meaning began to settle into place. This had not been a mistake. He had increased the rent on purpose. I walked back to the desk and sat down again, studying the numbers once more. $2,500 every month was more than enough to cover the property taxes, the maintenance fund, and still leave a comfortable cushion afterward. Harold would have raised his eyebrows at that number and given me that quiet grin he used whenever something worked out better than expected. I folded the check carefully and placed it back into the envelope with a note. For a long moment, I sat there listening to the stillness of the building. Upstairs, the apartment remained silent, the hardwood floors and tall windows standing exactly the way Harold and I had restored them all those years ago. Pathetic, Ashley had said the night before. I let the word pass through my mind once more, but this time it sounded very different. I sat there for a long time with the envelope resting quietly on Harold's old desk. The building around me had that familiar late morning stillness, the kind that only small places seem to have. Somewhere in the pipes a faint hum passed through the walls, the same sound I had heard for years whenever someone upstairs turned on the hot water. I folded the note again and slid it carefully into the envelope beside the check, then placed both inside the top drawer of the desk. Harold used to say money should never be handled in a hurry. Numbers deserved patience. I leaned back in the chair and let my eyes travel around the office. The room had not changed much since the day we first set it up together. The same faded calendar on the wall. The same oak bookshelf holding 30 years of property records and maintenance folders. Harold believed in keeping everything organized. A building is like a living thing, he used to say. If you take care of it properly, it will take care of you. Back then I thought he was just being sentimental. Now I understood he had been practical. Outside the window, a delivery truck rolled slowly down the alley and then disappeared around the corner. Life moved forward the way it always did, steady and quiet. I opened the desk drawer again and looked at the envelope one more time before closing it. $2,500 each month. That single number changed more than Ashley would ever realize. It covered the annual property tax with room to spare. It handled repairs without touching my savings. Most important of all, it meant I did not need to depend on anyone else. Independence becomes a very simple equation after a certain age. A roof. A quiet place to live. Enough income to cover what life asks from you. Harold had arranged all of that long before either of us knew how important it would become. I stood and walked slowly through the hallway again, letting my hand brush lightly across the painted railing along the staircase. The wood felt smooth beneath my fingers, worn from decades of use, but still strong. When Harold bought this place 30 years ago, the building had looked tired and forgotten. The windows were cracked, the floors scratched, and the porch leaned slightly toward the street like it was tired of standing. We spent 2 summers fixing everything together. He replaced pipes while I sanded floors. He repaired the roof while I repainted the trim around every window. Neighbors used to stop and watch us work, shaking their heads at the effort we poured into that little brick building. Harold never minded. He always believed value did not come from size or appearance. It came from care. I stepped outside onto the front porch and looked across Maple Street. The small bakery on the corner had just opened its doors, and the scent of fresh bread drifted through the cool air. A young couple walked past with a stroller, talking quietly as they headed toward the park 2 blocks away. The neighborhood had not changed much over the years. That was part of its quiet strength. Some places do not need to impress anyone. They simply continue being exactly what they are. I sat down on the wooden porch bench Harold built the year we finished the renovations. The wood creaked softly beneath my weight but held firm, just like everything else he had worked on. My mind drifted briefly back to the dinner table the night before. Ashley's voice. The way she said the word pathetic, as if it were an obvious truth. I did not feel angry when I remembered it. Instead, I felt something much calmer than that. Perspective has a way of softening insults when time gives you enough evidence to measure them against. The building behind me stood solid and quiet in the morning light, its brick walls warm from the rising sun. Upstairs, apartment 2B waited with sunlight pouring through the tall windows that faced the street. Downstairs, my office drawer held an envelope that quietly confirmed something Harold had known all along. Some things that look small from the outside carry far more weight than people expect. Later that afternoon, I returned home to my small house across town, the same quiet place where Harold and I had lived for nearly 3 decades before he passed away. The house felt peaceful the moment I stepped inside. Sunlight stretched across the living room floor, and the grandfather clock near the hallway ticked steadily the way it always had. I set my purse on the kitchen counter and placed the envelope from Maple Street beside the coffee maker. I did not open it again. I already knew exactly what was inside. Instead, I filled the kettle with water and turned on the stove. Small routines have a way of organizing a person's thoughts. As the water warmed, I looked through the window above the sink toward the backyard where Harold used to keep his vegetable garden. The raised wooden beds were still there even though I had not planted tomatoes in a few years. Some habits change after loss. Others remain quietly in place. While the kettle heated, I thought about something Harold used to say whenever we discussed money. He believed that financial independence was not about becoming rich. It was about never having to ask permission to live your own life. Back when he first bought the Maple Street building, I remember worrying about the risk. It had been a stretch for us, financially at the time. But Harold simply shrugged and told me that brick and land were patient investments. They did not rush. They waited. When the kettle began to whistle, I poured the hot water into a mug and carried it to the small kitchen table. My phone rested beside the salt shaker where I had left it earlier that morning. As if on cue, it vibrated gently against the wood. Daniel's name appeared on the screen. I answered after the second ring. His voice sounded casual, almost hesitant. He asked how my morning had been and whether I had visited the Maple Street building like I usually did at the beginning of each month. I told him that I had. There was a small pause on the line before he spoke again. Ashley had apparently mentioned the building to a few of their friends the night before. According to Daniel, some of them had laughed at the idea that anyone would still rent an apartment that size. I listened quietly while he talked. The same calm feeling I had earlier remained with me now. Eventually, Daniel asked the question he had really called to ask. He wondered how much rent I was charging the new tenant. I glanced at the envelope resting on the counter across the room. For a moment, I imagined Harold leaning against the doorway with that familiar patient smile of his. I answered simply, "Enough to keep everything running smoothly." Daniel seemed satisfied with that explanation, though I could hear curiosity lingering in his voice. After we ended the call, I returned the phone to the table and took a slow sip of tea. Outside, a breeze moved gently through the trees behind the house. Somewhere down the street, a lawnmower started up with a steady mechanical hum. Ordinary sounds of an ordinary afternoon. Light stretching across the kitchen floor, the kind of quiet start that makes a person feel as though the world has decided to move a little slower for a while. I woke early as usual and prepared breakfast the same way I had for years, 2 pieces of toast and a cup of black coffee at the small wooden table beside the window. Routine has a way of steadying the mind. While I buttered the toast, my eyes drifted toward the envelope still resting neatly on the counter. I had placed it there the day before after returning from Maple Street, and it had not moved since. Some things do not need constant attention to remain important. After finishing breakfast, I washed the dishes and placed them carefully in the drying rack before picking up my purse and heading out the door. The air outside carried that crisp morning freshness that only early autumn brings. The drive to Maple Street took about 15 minutes, passing the same quiet shops and brick storefronts that had been part of the town for decades. When I pulled into the small lot beside the building, I noticed Ethan's silver sedan already parked in its usual spot. That told me he had not yet left for work. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The hallway smelled faintly of coffee again, a comforting sign of normal life moving along inside the building. As I reached the staircase, Ethan appeared at the top step, holding a travel mug in one hand and his briefcase in the other. He greeted me with the same respectful tone he always used. I told him that I appreciated his thoughtfulness and that the apartment would always be properly cared for as long as he lived there. Ethan nodded and headed down the stairs toward the door, his footsteps echoing lightly through the hallway before fading outside. I walked slowly through the building once more, checking the small details that Harold had taught me never to ignore. Real estate office in town. That cousin had mentioned that properties on Maple Street had been increasing in value over the past few years because several technology companies had opened offices only a few blocks away. Daniel explained this carefully, as if he were sharing information I might not have heard yet. I listened patiently while he talked. Apartment 2B reflected the sky like quiet mirrors. Some people measure value by appearance. Others learn to recognize it only after time has revealed what something is truly capable of providing. The following weekend, Daniel called again, but this time his tone carried a noticeable shift. It was subtle at first, the kind of careful politeness people adopt when they are trying to understand something they recently underestimated. He asked if I would be home that afternoon because he and Ashley were thinking about stopping by for a short visit. I told him that would be fine. The house was quiet when they arrived later that day, the autumn sun falling gently across the front porch while dry leaves gathered along the edge of the walkway. I opened the door before they had a chance to knock and welcomed them inside. Ashley stepped into the living room with the same confident posture she always carried, though this time her eyes moved slowly across the room as if she were studying details she had never noticed before. Daniel settled into the armchair near the window, while Ashley remained standing near the fireplace. For a moment no one said very much. Finally, Ashley spoke. Her voice sounded lighter than usual, almost conversational. She mentioned that Daniel had told her the Maple Street neighborhood had become very popular recently. Apparently, several young professionals had begun renting apartments there because the new technology offices downtown were only a short walk away. I listened quietly while she spoke. Then she asked if the new tenant seemed reliable. I told her that Ethan Brooks had been respectful, responsible, and appreciative of the building. Ashley nodded thoughtfully and then asked another question that felt slightly more deliberate. She wondered if I had ever considered raising the rent since property values in that area had increased so much. I leaned back comfortably in my chair before answering. The rent had already been adjusted recently, I explained. In fact, the new tenant had insisted on paying more than the original lease required. Both Daniel and Ashley looked up at that. Ashley tilted her head slightly, clearly curious. She asked how much the new rent happened to be. I answered calmly. $2,500 each month. The room became very quiet after that. Daniel blinked once, as if he had not expected the number to be quite that high. Ashley did not speak immediately. Instead, she sat down slowly on the edge of the sofa and folded her hands together in her lap. I could almost see the numbers moving through her mind as she calculated what that amount meant over the course of a year. After a moment, she gave a small nod and said that sounded like a very strong return for such a modest building. I smiled politely, but said nothing else. The silence that followed did not feel uncomfortable to me. Outside the living room window, a breeze moved through the maple tree in the front yard, scattering a few golden leaves across the grass. Daniel eventually cleared his throat and mentioned that if I ever needed help managing the property, he would be happy to assist. Ashley agreed quickly, adding that having family involved in real estate decisions was usually a wise idea. I listened to their suggestions with patience and appreciation, though inside I felt the same quiet certainty that had been growing stronger over the past week. The Maple Street building had taken care of itself for 30 years with nothing more than steady attention and careful maintenance. It did not require anyone's approval to continue doing so. After a while, the conversation drifted toward lighter topics, and the afternoon visit ended peacefully. When the front door closed behind them, the house returned to its familiar calm. I walked to the window and looked out across the yard while the last of the afternoon sunlight stretched across the grass. Somewhere across town, the small brick building on Maple Street continued standing exactly where it always had, quietly doing what it was built to do. The house remained quiet after Daniel and Ashley left that afternoon, the kind of calm that settles slowly once the front door closes and the sound of a car pulling away fades down the street. I stood near the window for a while, watching the last of the sunlight move across the yard. Autumn had begun to color the leaves of the maple tree in front of the house, turning the edges gold and copper in the late afternoon light. Moments like that always reminded me how time moves forward, whether anyone notices it or not. A few days later, I returned to Maple Street again, following the same simple routine Harold and I had kept for years. The bakery across the street was busy that morning, and the familiar scent of fresh bread drifted gently through the air. I unlocked the building door and stepped inside, hearing the quiet echo of my footsteps along the hallway floor. Everything looked exactly as it should. The mailboxes were tidy. The stair railing was secure. The hallway light glowed softly against the painted walls. When you take care of something long enough, it begins to carry a certain kind of quiet dignity. I climbed the stairs slowly and paused near apartment 2B, where sunlight poured through the tall windows just the way Ethan had described. A moment later, the door opened and Ethan stepped out with a friendly nod when he saw me. He mentioned that he had just received confirmation of a promotion at his company and that he hoped to remain in the apartment for many years if possible. I congratulated him and told him the place would always be available as long as he needed it. He smiled and thanked me again for maintaining the building so carefully. After he left for work, I walked back downstairs and stepped outside onto the small porch. The street looked peaceful in the morning light, the brick buildings along Maple Street standing in the quiet confidence of structures that had been part of the neighborhood for generations. I sat for a moment on the bench Harold built and allowed myself to reflect on how many years had passed since we first stood here together with paintbrushes and tool belts, repairing every small detail that others had ignored. Back then, people thought we were putting too much effort into something so modest. But Harold always believed that steady work and patience created value that others could not immediately see. Now, the building stood solid behind me, quietly providing exactly what he predicted it would one day offer. Financial independence. Stability. A place that asked nothing from anyone else. I stood and brushed a small leaf from the porch railing before locking the front door again. As I walked toward my car, I remembered Ashley's voice from that dinner table not so long ago. The dismissive tone she used when describing the building she had never truly understood. The word no longer carried any sting. Time had answered it far better than I ever could have. Some things may look small from the outside, but they quietly hold more strength and value than the people who judge them ever expect.